Could the Chancellor be about to cut taxes? Why does council tax keep going up? And can the government salvage its Rwanda plan? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Danny Kruger, Labour's Shadow Business Minister Sarah Jones, The Mirror's Associate Editor Kevin Maguire and journalist and broadcaster Inaya Folarin Iman. Today is the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt gearing up for a tax giveaway this week.
I do believe lower taxes are essential to a dynamic, thriving economy.
But with sluggish growth in the economy, can he really afford it? Could benefit claimants get a smaller rise than they were expecting?
If they're not going to increase the amount of income people get, but the cost of things is still going up by 5%, then you've got less money.
In government, I will use the inflation rate that is traditional, the September inflation, to uprate benefits.
One tax which is almost certain to go up is council tax. We'll find out why. And are senior Conservatives divided on whether to press ahead with plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda? Well, it's all about the economy this week as we have the autumn statement on Wednesday, and the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has said this in a speech this morning.
Inflation, then cut taxes. And that's why I made the promise to halve inflation. And the official statistics show that promise has now been met. So now that inflation is halved and our growth is stronger, meaning revenues are higher, we can begin the next phase and turn our attention to cutting tax. We can't do everything all at once. It will take discipline and we need to prioritise. But over time, we can and we will cut taxes.
Rishi Sunak there. My opening question to the panel is how responsible would it be to cut taxes this week?
Well, I think it is the right thing to do. We'll see what the Chancellor's cooking up, but the encouraging news is that the original Treasury forecasts turned out to be pessimistic. There's more space in the public finances. They underestimated the revenue that would come. The economy has grown better than it was feared. We've seen that inflation has come down. I think the right thing to do this week is to boost growth by cutting taxes and support people's family finances. My preference for that would be a cut on, or rather a raising of the VAT threshold to help more small businesses take on more work, employ more people and do more services in the economy. But there'll be different choices before the Chancellor. I think it is important that we see taxes come down this week. They are at an absolutely historic and unsustainable high.
Well, that is true. Sarah, how responsible would it be to cut taxes now?
Well, it was good to see inflation come down, but of course food inflation has gone up 28%, something like that, over the last 2 years.
It's still running at 10%.
Prices are still very, very high. And what we're looking at is a 13-year government that has had the highest taxes we've seen in generations, and the most struggles we've seen for years in terms of public services.
Do you think now is the time to cut taxes?
Of course, we want people to be paying less tax. Of course we do. And the principles that we would adhere to are about helping working people. Right. And we've set that out with a couple of our policies around scrapping the non-dom status, for example, or putting the VAT on private schools.
Would it be responsible to cut taxes now?
Well, we'll have to see. We've had, I think, about 40 different...
We will see, but what do you
about
think?
40 different taxes have been bandied around. Inheritance tax came and went, various other ones we've seen over the weekend. We will see what the Chancellor does. But we do need to see a move towards lower taxes. That's, of course, what we want to see. But the key that Rachel Reeves keeps talking about is that we want to see growth. That's how we're going to improve the economy over the long run. That's how we're going to reduce inflation. That's how we're going to get the economy moving, people's wages up. So we'll see what he has to say. But this is the end of 13 years of a failed economic policy.
Is it responsible now to cut taxes, Kevin?
I think it'd be a big gamble and a risk. It's not where the public is. The public would rather any extra cash went into public services, which in many cases are on their knees. If you do cut taxes, it's how much do you spend, and then who do you spend it on? Because growth is actually flatlining. There is very little in the economy. It's true the tax burden is the highest for 70 years, although there's almost a fetish around that, because it's really who is paying the tax, because the tax burden, for instance, is higher in Germany and France than it is in the UK, and their disposable incomes are higher, their living standards are higher than ours. So it would depend where you cut tax and how much have you got. But if he's looking for political gain from this, I go back to 1997. I'm old enough. I had black hair then. I remember Ken Clarke cut income tax just before an election, got zero political credit for it.
Right. Well, we'll come back to that point in a minute. Do you think it would be responsible to cut taxes now?
Well, it just depends on which taxes we're cutting. I mean, as was mentioned, we heard about inheritance tax, and that would send, I think, completely the wrong message to the public at this difficult time. But for example, if you are a young person and you are paying off a student loan, you're effectively paying a higher marginal rate of tax because you're paying off your student loan, and also you're taxed on top of that with normal national insurance and income tax and so on. So I do think that there could be some space which it would economically benefit people. But I think that, again, it just does seem like tinkering around the edges. If the Prime Minister really thinks that this is going to be the transformative policy a year to the election when they're running so far behind in the polls, and we've had 13 years of Conservative government, I just don't think he's going to get the returns on what he expects.
Right, do you agree with that?
Well, I do to a degree. I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right to concentrate on the deliverable bread and butter issues that the people are concerned about. Quite rightly, that includes the high rate of tax. It includes our national debt as well, actually, which Labour proposed to increase. So I think there are these important... No, so I think we have to get the economic fundamentals right, but we have to go further. And I hope that today was the first stage in that process. Beyond starting to deliver on his 5 pledges, he needs to deliver, I think, a far bolder message for the public about the kind of country we want to be. And that opens up a very useful dividing line with Labour, because in my view, the Conservative vision of our country, which includes lower taxation, but includes stronger families, stronger communities, stronger border control. But these principles, I think, are useful ones politically for us, and they're the right thing for him to do.
When Labour was last in power, debt was 60% of GDP. It's now 100%. The Conservatives are the party
to borrow another £28 billion a year.
Our fiscal rules are very clear that we will reduce the debt, and we will do what many countries around the world have done, whether it's the US, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere, to invest in businesses, to bring in private sector investment into our country, which this government has completely failed to do, which is why we have such low growth and such a weak
foreign investment
economy.
is high, but I think
foreign investment is
on a point of
a lot
agreement
lower than it was under the last
on a point of agreement. I think that is absolutely right. We do need to see more investment in business, and the government has, one of its great tax reforms is to enable people to deduct expenditure on plant and technology. We do need that. So I think we absolutely can. We do need to boost growth. That is the way to reduce inflation.
Right. Well, it's interesting that the conversation is turning much more towards boosting growth, which was very much the mantra of the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. It feels, Kevin, as if the Prime Minister thinks inflation is done. Now, inflation has come down, but the increase in prices is still going up, just albeit more slowly. But it's still 2.5 times higher than the Bank of England target.
No, it is at 4.6% on the CPI count. 2% is the target. If it's the RPI, the Retail Prices Index, which includes mortgage costs, that's 6.1%. So it is still high, and all those increases that people endured are baked in. So it's just that prices aren't going up as fast as they were before. But he's given himself a victory lap and patting himself on the back, because it's the only one of the 5 goals he set himself that he's likely to hit by the end of the year.
He set a different set of goals this morning. We've got another 5.
Long-term plans.
We're forgetting that 5.
He's actually. I mean, listen. I'm a critic of the government in some respects, as you might be aware. So I'm not here just to blow the trumpet for the government. However, just on the point, the 5 pledges that the PM set out are being met. Each one of them is on the right trajectory. So we are...
Debt is falling?
Yes, all of these things are on track.
No.
Wait a second.
NHS hospital waiting lists are up, and he hasn't stopped the boats.
So none of these things have yet been achieved, but the trajectory is in the right direction, including on the boats, where 30% numbers are down.
Inayat, do you agree with that? Is the trajectory going in the right direction when it comes to cutting NHS waiting lists, to debt falling, to growth rising, halving inflation, although, again, critics would say that that's not because of anything the government has done. It might be because of stuff the government hasn't done, so they haven't done anything reckless, that actually the trajectory isn't in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that the public aren't stupid, and I think what we're seeing with Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is a level of boosterism in order to essentially compensate for the other pledges that he's made that have been far off of achieving. So what we're seeing is talking up something that is vaguely in his control, and we know when it comes to other issues which we're going to go on to talk about, like Rwanda, he has catastrophically failed, and people can see that.
I mean, can I just go back though to the core question, which is, are you all right there? You've got your water? No, don't worry, everyone's got colds and coughs at this time of year. How responsible would it be though at this point to cut taxes when we've just talked about the fact that inflation is still running at nearly 5%, when the debt is soaring and interest debt payments are soaring too, and there's barely any growth? There's a tiny bit, but there's barely any growth.
Yes, well, we need to stimulate growth, so any tax reduction should be with that purpose in mind. And
but that might fuel inflation.
So inflation is driven by too much money chasing too few goods. So what we need to do is to produce more goods. There's a monetary policy dimension to this, which is important too, about the amount of money that's circulating in the economy. But what the government can affect is growth through targeted tax cuts to boost production, which is why I think raising the VAT threshold would be a very good call for the Chancellor.
Right. Will this make people feel better? The old adage is, do you feel better than you did at the beginning of this Parliament, broadly paraphrasing? Will the government be able to help people feel better?
Yeah, and the projection at the moment is people will be worse off at the next election than they were at the last, which is economically damaging for a government. I think it's very difficult because people get into a mindset. They can see, they look at their bank accounts, their purses, their wallets, their wage package, what it can buy. They remember how they were before. If you're just giving them a marginal improvement now, so it isn't as bad as it was earlier, they're not going to feel better off. There's going to be no, hey, thank you very much, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. I think that point has passed for the government, and that there is no real growth in the economy.
And there's not forecast to be any real growth in the economy.
Wages are finally going up more than inflation. But we've had the worst wage squeeze in history. So people are not going to say thank you for a couple of pennies when they've lost pounds.
And so if I may, I mean, I think Kevin's got a really important point. We've got an economic model that over the last 20, 25 years has systematically undermined the productivity of the British economy, caused wage stagnation, inflation of assets. All of these problems started under Labour, I'm afraid to say continued under us. Let's just acknowledge that the cross-party consensus has failed.
And I think 13 years. Well, if you're admitting that it's happened in the 13 years.
The regret for me is that we came in 2019 with a pledge to change all of that. There was a resounding mandate for economic change. Yeah. What happened is we've had political turmoil, we've had Ukraine and COVID.
Why would anyone vote for you again?
Because that is a very good question, and what we need to put to the public is our coherent alternative to Labour's strategy, which is actually, because they're so determined to appear reasonable, they are the ones proposing the continuation of the failed economic model of the last 20 years. We stand for change, and I know it's very difficult to say that because we're the government in power, but that was what 2019 was. The public put their trust in the Conservatives to deliver change, and we still can.
I think David Cameron from that
this is the thing. I think it's going to be very hard to believe when many of the people that were essentially voted out before have been brought back in to run the government.
So I've criticised the reshuffle on that basis. I'm an admirer of David Cameron. I work for him, but I think politically the reshuffle indicated a change of direction of personnel back to the past. But actually we can still do it, and I'm urging the Prime Minister by every means possible, including this one, to honour the 2019 coalition of voters that brought us into power.
Right, and on that, the inheritance tax discussion, it does look, Inaya is right, as if that has been set aside. Would that have sent the wrong message?
Yes. I mean, that was an interesting bit of kite flying, wasn't it? And I hope the kite was shot down by those of us who said this is the wrong priority. We need to be investing in working people, supporting family finances. I mean, I do think inheritance tax is iniquitous, it's wrong in principle, and it's harmful, and many people want it scrapped. But I think the priority should be tax cuts for working people, for ordinary families and small businesses. Right,
in talking of borrowing, you'll have heard the Chancellor now saying, Sarah, about Chancellor Nigel Lawson under Margaret Thatcher, famously saying that government borrowing is a tax on the future. He was talking about the 20 or 28 billion pounds or so Labour is committed to investing in green policies. Do you agree with that it is just a tax on the future?
Well, the first rule, and forgive me for my coughing fit, first rule for our government under Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will be economic stability and fiscal responsibility.
Sure, but on that,
so we will have some fixed rules and we will not break those rules, and they will be absolutely clear. The fiscal lock in place so that we can never have what we had under Liz Truss, where we borrowed to tax to fund tax cuts, and the economy sank as a result. We want to invest in British industries, because the way to grasp the opportunities of the future is to invest in those industries that other people are investing in. If you talk to business, as I do, they're investing in America, they're investing in the EU, they're investing elsewhere because the incentives aren't here. So with every pound that we put in through our National Wealth Fund, we want to see £3 from the private sector. That is how we grow
and so
the economy.
You're just going to stick to Tory spending plans, which is, of course, what the Blair government did after the Tories in 1997. You'll do the same.
Well, we've said very different things. Our principles are very different from the current Conservative principles.
Maybe, but the reality
we have said we
is
will
that you'll
inject,
stick to their spending
we will
plans.
inject funding into the NHS to bring those waiting lists down, because the only way we can grow the economy, bring inflation down, is to get people off those waiting lists.
But
we have a completely different ideological outlook when it comes to investing in our businesses and industries of the future. Keir Starmer was in Aberdeen on Friday talking about how we transition people away from the old oil and gas industries to the very new and very exciting offshore floating wind, or whether it's carbon capture. These are really exciting opportunities for the future that this government has completely failed to grasp.
Just briefly, what does it say, depending on what Jeremy Hunt does announce, what will it say about the timing of an election in Iowa?
Well, I think that, many people think that we should have an election as soon as possible because this government is essentially on life support. But what we have just heard, though, I think this is what I think is going to be very difficult for members of the public. And I think voter turnout might be a very interesting question as the next election comes about. That I think when it comes to the Labour Party, they're really just banking on the Conservatives, failing in the polls and dissatisfaction amongst the public, rather than actually having a different vision that's substantially going to change people's lives. And I think that that's not the kind of inspiring vision that's going to take us forward.
I think it'll tell us that the election will be around this time next year, and it's
Right.
longer term. Look, Prime Ministers don't give up power easily.
No.
If you're Rishi Sunak, you look at those polls, you may not get another chance. This is it. So you might as well stay in Downing Street for another year. Whatever you say about the case for an election now, which I get and I would endorse, he's not going to relinquish it easily.
Right, let's talk about benefits, because there has been some discussion about what the government will do, what the Chancellor will announce in terms of increasing or uprating, as we call it, benefits for next April. Usually it's the September figure that is taken, which was far higher when it came to inflation than the October figure. We still haven't heard yet what the government will do. Let me just show you this headline. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has said Labour would increase benefits in line with September inflation, which would be 6.7%. Should the government do the same?
Well, let's see. I mean, I think in principle...
What do you think?
I think benefits should match earnings as much as possible, because we're trying to support people into employment. So, but we have a fundamental problem in our welfare system. We are, I'm afraid to say, sustaining 5 million people on out-of-work benefits. There needs to be a reform to the system, which the government is now beginning to introduce to support people into work. And we see with the jobless figure is really, really concerning. We need to get... the vacancy rates are very, very concerning. We need to get people into those jobs. So I'm concerned about uprating benefits to the point where we're disincentivising people from getting into work.
Right. Do you agree with that?
Well, you've quoted Rachel Reeves and what she's going to do. I mean, the best way to get people off benefits now is to sort out the NHS waiting list, because we've got literally millions of people on that waiting list, and many of whom are able to work if they could have their operation. You've got, women in their 50s, people in their 50s who haven't come back to work after COVID. We need to tackle the NHS waiting list so that we can get people back into work. That has to be the starting point. And then we need to grow the economy. So we're creating the jobs that people can do and making sure we're skilling them in the right place as well. So we've had plans, which we announced at a conference, to make sure when you're looking at your local FE colleges, they are actually producing the kinds of courses for the skills that you need in each local area. So these things all have to match up, but you can't just sit back and blame people who are unable to work because they are waiting for an NHS operation.
I mean, the waiting lists speak for themselves, don't they, Danny? There are so many people who are claiming incapacity benefits who are waiting for treatment on the NHS.
I'm afraid so. We have endemic problems both in the health of the population and in our health service.
Punishing them by giving them less... Well, but that's what it would look like. They would have less money. The Resolution Foundation says it could be catastrophic for families on low incomes. So it needs to be well targeted, and obviously we shouldn't be cutting people on incapacity benefit, but we do need to be incentivising work, not welfare.
The UK benefit system is mean by international standards, as Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies said. Yeah, but then we are a big £2 trillion plus economy. Many of those people who are receiving benefits, in-work benefits through universal credit are in work. They're just in very low paid work, so you would hurt them too. But I find this whole debate about should we punish or deprive people who are on benefits, either in work or out of work. None of them are living the life of Riley. It's totally dispiriting. I remember David Cameron is like the ghost from governments past, but now he's returned. I remember the freezing of benefits in the Cameron Osborne time. It really hurt people, and there's a kind of horrible divide and rule side to that.
Well, I mean, I do think that there is this question about fairness, and I think a lot of people perhaps that are not on universal credit, would like to see their incomes increase as well. So as long as there is a match with the plan to make sure that wages are also increasing, that people that are not claiming benefits for whatever reason, I recognise that many are in work benefits as well, do feel like they're earning more money and their lives are getting better. And I think we don't want to create a situation where there is tension between people that are claiming benefits and those that are not.
I mean, it is a question of fairness, isn't it? And inflation is falling, finally. And so do those two figures then look disproportionate?
Yeah, but you have a reference point, and you do it annually. At that point, their cost of living, in fact, cost of living has gone up higher for the people on low incomes than it has on higher incomes, but it was 6.7%. All of a sudden, just say it's 4.6%, so I can save 2 billion, is it?
Yes. I mean, it isn't
public spending of $1 trillion plus. It's all about the politics, and it's bashing the poor to try and make a political point, and it is divide and rule all the time, and I think it's really, really unpleasant.
No, Kevin, I don't accept. Obviously, I don't accept that. I think, in fact, that is very divisive remark to make, because actually, we're all committed to the same principle. We want people in work. We want a thriving economy in which a family can support itself on its earned income. How do you do that? Well, you have a welfare system that rewards work, that supports people who are out of work for whatever reason, but makes it very clear that people should be working if they can. And it goes back to the broader point about the kind of economy we have. We've had 2 decades of low-wage economies. We've had immigration to compensate for it. We need a reform to our whole economic model to support family wages, to reduce the pressure from labour coming in from abroad, to support the wages that people earn. That requires profound economic reform, which I don't see Labour proposing.
How do you make other work, so a worker on the average wage, how do you make them better off by making somebody poorer off who's on less money?
Well, what we need to do is to drive up wages, which actually did happen briefly after Brexit, and we do that by investing in businesses themselves, by reducing the tax on investment, and crucially by reducing the downward pressure on wages that comes from having high immigration. We've had 8 million people join the British population in this century alone. That has depressed wages. So the way to drive up wages is to make British labour more valuable.
Higher wages are a good thing, aren't they?
Of course they're a good thing. I mean, I joined the Labour Party when I was 19, when I was pregnant, when Peter Lilly, the then Social Security Minister, made a speech saying, I've got a little list of ladies who get pregnant just to jump the housing queue. They will not be missed. They will not be missed. It's the same thing then, same thing now. Let's blame someone else for the mistakes that we've made, the economic choices we've made, the economy we've crashed. Let's blame other people. It's not the way to build the economy. It's not the way to help people.
I'm not blaming other people. I'm blaming the economic model, and we need to reform it. And we're not picking out individuals to blame, but the system as a whole is disincentivising the sort of economy that we need.
Let's talk about council tax. This headline in the Daily Telegraph: council tax to rise by £120 a year for average family home. Treasury's decision to allow increase, which happened this year, we're waiting to hear, of course, of up to 5%, will heap misery on struggling households, say campaigners. Let's talk to Councillor Michael Harrison, who's responsible for adult social care at North Yorkshire Council. Hello to you. How much of your budget, Michael, goes on social care?
So currently in the region of 40% for North Yorkshire Council. So we spend about £223 million out of a 560 net budget.
Right. I mean, what difference will council tax going up possibly to 5% if councils are allowed to do it again without a referendum? What difference will that make to the costs that you incur for adult social care?
Well, if we were to raise council tax by 5% in North Yorkshire, we'd receive about £22 million more in council tax revenue. Now, if we look at adult social care, in the last year, we've spent £36 million more than we did the year before. So, it'll help, but that's not going to be a solution. And going back to what one of the studio commentators earlier, my residents aren't going to be thanking me if I put the council tax up by 5% to pay for adult social care.
Well, that is what many people will say, won't they, constituents? We don't see where that money is going. Why not?
Well, absolutely. If we look at £560 million we raise in North Yorkshire, if you add in children's social care, about 60% has gone on those two services. And when residents say to me about potholes in the road, I say, well, there's potholes in the road because this is where we're spending our money. Now, in some respects, it's good that we're spending money in this sector. This is supporting the most vulnerable people in society. But we do need some kind of long-term strategy to deal with this, or else it's more money going somewhere where a lot of residents don't even see it.
Right, well, you say there needs to be a long-term strategy. You're a Conservative councillor. Boris Johnson, a former Conservative Prime Minister, promised to fix the problem of social care and how it's paid for. Has that government and other governments failed?
Well, I think governments of all colours have failed on this. We need a long-term solution that recognises the costs of providing adult social care, the benefit that appropriately funding the adult social care market would have on the NHS, and recognising that we need investment in workforce to ensure it is an attractive sector to work in. I actually think we need parity with the NHS, and then we'd find some of the things that you've been talking about earlier around waiting lists. The pressure would start to lessen on the NHS if true investment was put towards adult social care.
Danny, do you agree with councils being allowed to increase council tax by perhaps up to 5%?
Well, I am sympathetic to that. I think well-run councils manage their budgets well. And Wiltshire Council, where I am, it has exactly the same problems that Michael's just describing. 60% of our budget goes on social care. I think there's a very wide structural problem again, which is, 70 years ago when the welfare state was created, there was no such thing as social care. Families looked after people in their old age. People didn't live for so long after retirement. We didn't have all these long-term chronic conditions, and we just had some charities doing this work. We now need, quite rightly, a proper national system for it, and we just don't have one. And no government has created. And I think it is. I think totally right. The point was made. We came into government in 2019 with a commitment to reform the social care system. Again, because of all the turmoil, we haven't done it, and I think that's deeply regrettable. We absolutely have to come forward with a proper plan to do this. Labour's, I don't know if we'll hear this reiterated, they propose a sort of nationalised NHS-style care service. I think that would be completely wrong. What we need is the best of the current system, which is that it is locally managed. People have personal responsibility. It involves families themselves. It's not all made into a big state bureaucracy. But we do need better funding. The government has, to its credit, put an extra £3 billion into social care just now. They've increased council funding by the rate of inflation. So there is money going into it, but the fundamental system is broken.
Right. Do you agree with councils being allowed to put up council tax by 5%?
On the state bureaucracy point, anybody who's used social care, you can see how bureaucratic it is. It doesn't work for individuals. So absolutely, you need a proper care service.
Should councils be allowed again to raise?
Well, we'll have to see whether that is what's suggested. But look, councils have been starved of funding, and the government are going to the pockets of working people again to find the money. We do have to find the money for social care, of course we do. But here we are again after 13 years of lack of funding, lack of investment, lack of growth.
Michael, may I ask what has happened to your central government funding since 2010? And you will know that council tax is a particularly unpopular tax. Do you sometimes feel that the central government is subcontracting onto you a tax rise, so you take the hit and you get the political popularity while it hopes to protect itself?
Well, clearly, if we have to manage our budget by increasing our council tax, we're going to feel the political impact locally. But from my perspective, what we need is a recognition that councils, when they're given the money to invest in services, do so very well. And working so closely together with the NHS, we could make such a difference on the social care side and reducing the pressure on the NHS. Investment from the NHS in community nursing, in therapists, in virtual wards, that will help immensely, whilst at the same time, true investment in the workforce to make sure it's an attractive sector to work in, it would make a huge difference.
And has your central government funding gone up or down?
Well,
since
the
2010.
issue is we get central government funding. We've had an extra £19 million this year, but we're going to spend £36 million more.
Right.
So we are getting amounts of money, and anything we get, we will invest wisely, but the costs are outstripping the funding that's coming.
So it's not sustainable, is it, Tanaya?
Well, this is the thing, that many successive governments have kicked this issue into the long grass. More recently, under Boris Johnson, as was alluded to, the national insurance was meant to increase in order to pay for social care, and very little of that money ended up going there. And it was reversed, I think, under Liz Truss. And so this issue is going to get worse. We have an ageing population, and our population outside of that is increasing as a whole. And what this does look like, as was alluded to, is that the government is essentially contracting councils to do it, so that they don't actually take the responsibility of having a long-term plan to actually fund this.
I mean, it is a bit like outsourcing, isn't it? I mean, you talked about the social care levy. That was cancelled. The delaying of the implementation of the social care cap to 2025. Why is it that successive governments, Gordon Brown was accused of introducing a death tax, Theresa May misguidedly tried to introduce a social care policy going into the 2017 election and was punished for it, and yet, in the end, this seems to be at the heart of the issues with the NHS and paying for adult social care?
I'm afraid that's absolutely right. I mean, the reason is obvious. It's very, very expensive to do it. And it's a minority of people who rely on social care. So the costs will fall generally on the taxpayer if we follow any sort of tax-based solution, and the benefits will be felt by a few. But we do need profound reform. And going back to the question of councils having more autonomy over their tax rates, I think we do need that. But we have a very centralised system. So we need, I think, to devolve more power and responsibility to local areas. And then we can have a more bottom-up social care system rather than a top-down centralised one.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I'll show you this headline in The Observer, Labour to omit funding of social care reform from manifesto. Do you think that's true? Would that be a dereliction of duty after everything you've said about the National Care Service, which was supposed to be an available service with personal care provided free at the point of use and access for everyone? Are you still committed to that?
Well, we've set out how we want to have a care service that works with the principle of keeping people in their homes. Right. And of course, we're going to have to, when it comes to the manifesto, I don't know what's going to be in the manifesto. When it comes to that, we're going to have to look at the finances as they stand and do what we can, taking into account the crashing of the economy we saw last year and all of that. But look, the principle absolutely is there. Most of the social care money that's spent isn't spent in the margins of whether people need to sell their home or not. That's very, very important. But a lot of the funding goes elsewhere. We need to look at all of that. How can carers be supported to be able to carry on caring? How can individuals actually get the services that they need? How do we professionalise social care? Because it's not really treated equally to other professions. All of these things.
Can I just say, I just think that the point about a long-term cross-party consensus, that's very good, what we've just heard. That is exactly what we need. The government says all the same things as well, of course. It really is important.
They don't do it.
Well, it's because it's so difficult politically, but perhaps
down at elections. That's what happened in
that's
2010.
Right.
Then it happened in 2017 with the dementia tax. Labour's bottling it this time, as the Conservative Party's bottling it.
And it looks like Labour are bottling it too.
Well, both bottling. You're both bottlers.
Right. All right.
Well,
on that, Michael,
if you don't mind me saying, using language like death taxes and dementia taxes, that feeds the wrong message. My own view is, councils prove over the years that they will do very good things with the money that they get, working closely with the NHS to prevent people having to leave their homes. We will do it, but we need all parties to give us a long-term solution and have a grown-up conversation about this.
Michael, thank you very much for joining us there from North Yorkshire. Let's talk about Rwanda, the government's plan to send asylum seekers. There was delivered a huge blow when the Supreme Court last Wednesday voted unanimously that that plan was unlawful. Danny, why and what is the point of continuing with a policy that has been dismissed by the Supreme Court so categorically as being unlawful, dangerous and therefore unworkable?
Well, I mean, I find that ruling very, very disappointing. And
you might do, but that is the ruling.
Well, having read it very closely, actually, I'm really concerned about the principles that the court decided to follow. They basically said they're not going to allow the government to make its own agreements with other nations. It's going to judge those agreements itself. It's going to decide whether the Rwandan government will follow its own agreement or not. It's decided it's going to give more credence to the UN than to Parliament. And I think the fundamental principle here is who governs. The reason we need to stop the boats is obviously to defend to have border security. But there's a more fundamental issue at stake, which is that Parliament passed a law. Our democracy is at stake. The rule of law is actually at stake because fundamentally, a bill passed in Parliament should be supreme. And what the court has decided is that judgments made in Strasbourg, interpretations of European human rights laws, the opinion of the United Nations, all of these things matter more than what the British Parliament has decided. So I think we have a very important principle of parliamentary democracy at stake here, as well as this fundamental question about illegal migration.
How important is this policy of stopping the small boats, one of the pledges of Rishi Sunak to voters?
Well, in terms of the country's top 3 priorities, as far as I'm aware, it is the cost of living crisis, the NHS and the economy. But undoubtedly, immigration and, slightly separate, but issue around asylum seekers and refugees is a very big priority for many people in the country. And actually, just when we see people coming on the boats, and oftentimes they come into the country without any papers, they get taken into a black market economy and are vulnerable to exploitation. So there's a really important moral argument, as well as security and other issues at play. And actually, the idea that the Rwanda plan is this kind of immoral, unheard of policy just isn't true. I mean, actually, many countries in Europe, Germany, for example, are watching what's happening quite closely in the UK to see if it can replicate similar policies. But for the Prime Minister, he has made this one of his major pledges, and it has catastrophically failed so far, and this can only be very bad for him.
I would say the Supreme Court didn't say it was immoral necessarily. It didn't say that, and actually it didn't say that the UK couldn't use a third country to send asylum seekers. But what it did say was that Rwanda was not a safe country for that to happen, and that the risk of genuine refugees or those with very good applications were at risk of being sent back to their country of origin, where they may face persecution. Does that leave legitimate room for the government to upgrade its treaty with Rwanda and therefore continue to pursue that policy?
It can attempt to do that because you're quite right. It was the country chosen. So that's where I reject Danny's analysis. I don't think that was the ruling. If it had Switzerland or France or Germany, then it would have stood. But it was going to Rwanda, which has a pretty poor human rights record and mistreatment of asylum seekers and refugees. So the government can attempt to revive it, but I think it will fail yet again because of Rwanda's history. And it's not just the European Convention of Human Rights, which I know some in the Conservative Party go potty over. It is also United Nations obligations, and it is also UK laws.
Right. Do you go potty over the ECHR? Have you gone potty over it?
I do. I mean, frankly, the ECHR is at the bottom of this, but that's true. There's a whole bunch of other conventions, refugees conventions.
The judge was very keen to state that.
But what is going on here is that the court has decided to apply its own understanding of a whole range of very complicated and cross-cutting laws, rather than accepting that the British government has passed a law that says it shall remove illegal immigrants. It made an agreement with Rwanda, with a sovereign state, a foreign policy decision that it will, and that Rwanda will honour. If for the court to just involve itself in deciding whether or not Rwanda can be trusted to apply an agreement made between our government and it, I think is a huge amount of overreach.
All right, well, let me just show you, not everyone agrees with you, Danny, you'll be surprised to hear. On the front page of the Times, Sunak faces cabinet row on new plan for Rwanda. Clearly, there are those senior secretaries of state who don't think it is wise to pursue leaving international treaties to which we are signatories in order to pursue the Rwanda policy further.
Yes, I recognise that. I'm afraid to say a lot of people, I think, have a cosmetic attachment to the text of the ECHR and to the notion of us being a great international player. In practice, obviously, we should honour the principles set out in the ECHR. We helped to write the principles back in the day. The United Kingdom, we do not need to be signatories to these conventions in order to do the right thing and to be a good country. And British Parliament is sovereign. We should be able to decide what we do.
Come on to that.
And that's the question at hand.
I think Danny's absolutely right. And I think this idea that the UK is this kind of complete denier and ignorer of human rights and will completely not take into account all of these factors is ridiculous. The question is, the key one that I think Danny put forward, which is who runs this country, who governs this country, and Parliament should be sovereign and able to make laws and affect the concerns that people have.
Do you have a cosmetic attachment to the European Convention on Human Rights?
Well, I mean, the two people who, who didn't face the death penalty in Russia in June, who used through the ECHR, avoided the death penalty, probably do.
We don't have the death penalty under UK law.
I think this is all just going down a rabbit hole. The point is, there is 175,000 people waiting in this country for an asylum decision. That gives the people smugglers a really good argument for why they need to take their money. We would recruit enough people to bring those case studies down. A lot of those people work in Croydon, in my constituency. You need a lot more caseworkers to bring the cases down so that people who can stay, people who can't go.
Where will you send them?
This government
the ones who'd refuse, where will you send them?
Well, you send them back to their home country, except you change the law so that we can't do any of these things anymore. The two pieces of legislation that this government has passed in the last 2 years, one of them has been watered down completely. One hasn't even been implemented because it can't be done. We just get tying ourselves in knots when the problem at hand are the people smugglers and the backlog. If we could just sort those, backlog, we wouldn't need any of this. And it's the government saying the solution's over there, the solution's over there, it's just over the hill, it's coming, and not dealing with the problem here now.
On the backlog, there are and is an unforeseen problem that has reared its head, according to the political editor of the Liverpool Echo, saying that many people who've had their asylum applications passed are now destitute on the streets of Liverpool, just as one example, and homeless. Have you thought, I mean, the government clearly hasn't, but have you thought about those consequences?
Of course, it's happening in Croydon as well. You're having people who are having, because the government has suddenly gone, we need to make some of these decisions very quickly. You need to do it in a staged way.
To do that,
we wouldn't have got to a point where we have 175,000. You need a slow managed transition so that you get away from using £7 million worth of hotels every day to being able to house the people who can stay, who are legitimate asylum seekers,
all of this is valid,
and send the other people back to the countries that they came
all of this
from.
is valid. There has been rapid increase in the number of processing that's going on, 6,000 a week now being processed.
And now we've got lots of people on the streets who haven't got anywhere to live.
Indeed, there needs to be all of these things need to be fixed. You're talking about important systemic changes to the process, but fundamentally there is no shortage of numbers of people around the world who, under the current rules, would be allowed to come and live in the UK if they can just pay the money to get here. We fundamentally need to put up a clear signal to the whole world that you cannot break into this country and have a home here. And if we can't get these flights to Rwanda, we cannot send that signal.
Danny, as somebody who's a journalist who's covered politics on and off since the Thatcher period, I find it very odd that some people in the Conservative Party are now saying, let's break the law and ignore the law.
It's not.
But you know, your vice chair said...
just put the planes in the air.
Lee Anderson, just dump them. But you mentioned earlier on that, and it's true, that on that Stop the Boats, the numbers crossing in those boats is down to about 30,000 this year compared to 45,000 last year, 30% cut, you said about half an hour ago. Do you not think, because you just obsess with Rwanda, you're taking the eye off how to actually solve this problem? And it's the hard yards. It is like deals with France to stop.
Well, deals with France have been attempted.
So thank you. So I think that's right. Thank you, Kevin, for pointing that out. It is true that there have been real successes. We have returns agreement, particularly with Albania, which has completely stopped the trade from smuggling from Albania. Countries that we can do a returns agreement with, we are doing, and that is succeeding. But as I was just saying, the current rules allow anybody who can get to the shores of the UK, and that often means spending a lot of money, so we're talking about the wealthy, the fit, can get to the UK and then claim asylum and basically live here for life. We have absolutely got to stop that rules, which does require changes to the international legal framework. And talking about breaking the law, I'm trying to restore the legal basis of our country, parliamentary sovereignty. There's nothing higher than that.
Do you really think the Cabinet is going to agree to that Rishi Sunak is going to come forward and say, we are going to disapply, if that's the technical term, parts of international treaties, including the ECHR, the Refugee Convention and a convention around torture? I think all of these systems... Do you think that will happen, though? I know how you feel, but do you think that will genuinely happen?
I don't know. I think there's a very good chance of it happening because the legal case, as set out by the Rwanda judgment, is obvious that that's the only thing that will work, and the politics are pretty compelling too. So I'm hoping that he will see that he needs to do a Churchill. He needs to take part in a new design of a new legal framework.
What about the UN conventions?
Yes, likewise.
So you're just going to disapply them?
So I don't know if you think that everything that happened in the 1940s is somehow holy writ. Of course, as time changes, we are in the era of mass migration. We need to change the law.
And that's all we have time for today. I'll let them discuss because I'll be back tomorrow with more politics live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.